The shovel bit into Virginia soil with the desperate urgency of a woman who understood that every swing brought freedom, one step closer to those who had never known it. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her bleeding hands against the wooden handle, her elegant widow's dress now caked with mud and determination, as she carved another foot of tunnel beneath her grand estate house in the pre-dawn darkness of December 1850. Above her, the floorboards creaked with the footsteps of 7 runaway slaves who had arrived at her door 3 hours earlier, their eyes holding the haunted desperation of people who knew that capture meant death or worse. If you're ready to discover one of the most audacious acts of resistance in Underground Railroad history, where a Virginia socialite risked everything to build freedom beneath her own foundation, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because Eleanor Whitmore's secret tunnel would become the most important passage to freedom in the entire Confederacy. The year was 1850, and the recently passed Fugitive Slave Act had transformed the entire United States into a hunting ground where enslaved people could be captured and returned to bondage regardless of which state they reached. The law had effectively nationalized slavery, requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and imposing severe penalties on anyone who aided escapees. What had once been a relatively safe journey to northern states had become a gauntlet of professional slave catchers, federal marshals, and bounty hunters who could claim their prey anywhere on American soil. Richmond County, Virginia, sat at the heart of this transformed landscape, a region where tobacco plantations stretched across rolling hills that had been fertilized with the blood and sweat of enslaved labor for over 2 centuries. The county's proximity to Washington, D.C., and its network of rivers and roads made it a crucial corridor for both the slave trade and the Underground Railroad, creating a constant tension between those who profited from human bondage and those who risked everything to end it. Whitmore Manor stood on a hill overlooking the Rappahannock River, its Georgian architecture and manicured gardens testament to the wealth that Virginia's plantation economy had generated for families like the Whitmores. The estate had been built in 1784 by Eleanor's late husband's grandfather, using profits from tobacco cultivation and the sale of human beings who were bred like livestock and sold at markets throughout the South. For 3 generations, the Whitmore family had been pillars of Virginia society, their names synonymous with refinement, prosperity, and unwavering support for the institution that made their lifestyle possible. Eleanor Whitmore herself presented a contradiction that would have puzzled anyone who knew her only from her public appearances at Richmond's most exclusive social gatherings. At 38 years old, she possessed the kind of classical beauty that Virginia society expected from its aristocratic women. Auburn hair arranged in perfect ringlets, porcelain skin unmarred by outdoor labor, and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, carefully concealed beneath layers of feminine deference. She had been educated at the finest finishing schools in Charleston and had mastered all the accomplishments expected of a lady of her station: French conversation, pianoforte performance, watercolor painting, and the subtle art of managing a household built upon enslaved labor. But beneath this carefully cultivated exterior lay a mind that had been secretly questioning the foundations of her world since childhood, when she had witnessed her father's overseer whipping a pregnant woman for the crime of asking for lighter work duties. The image of that woman's blood staining Virginia soil had planted seeds of moral rebellion that would eventually bloom into the most dangerous form of resistance imaginable: active participation in the Underground Railroad in the heart of Confederate Virginia. The transformation that had turned Eleanor from a compliant society wife into the most effective Underground Railroad conductor in the Upper South had begun with her husband's death 3 years earlier. Colonel James Whitmore had been killed in the Mexican-American War, leaving behind a widow who suddenly found herself in control of vast wealth and property that she had never been allowed to manage independently. For the first time in her life, Eleanor possessed both the resources and the authority to act upon convictions that she had been forced to suppress throughout her marriage to a man who viewed enslaved people as valuable property requiring careful management. The estate that Eleanor had inherited encompassed not only the main house and its immediate grounds, but also 12 separate tobacco plantations scattered throughout Richmond County, worked by nearly 800 enslaved people whose lives she now controlled with absolute legal authority. The irony was not lost on her that the very system she hoped to undermine had placed her in a position of unprecedented power over the lives of the people she wanted to help escape to freedom. The decision to begin her Underground Railroad activities had not come easily, as Eleanor understood that discovery would mean not only her own destruction, but potentially the deaths of every enslaved person who had aided her efforts. Virginia law prescribed death for enslaved people who assisted runaways, while white accomplices faced lengthy prison terms and financial ruin. The social consequences would be equally devastating. A woman of Eleanor's standing who was discovered helping runaway slaves would be completely ostracized from the society that had defined her entire existence. But the moral urgency that drove Eleanor's actions had been crystallized by an incident that occurred just 6 months after her husband's death. Maria Santos, a young woman enslaved on one of the Whitmore plantations, had been sold to a slave trader after becoming pregnant by the plantation's overseer. Eleanor had watched from her carriage window as Maria was chained to a coffle of other enslaved people being marched toward the Richmond slave market, the woman's desperate cries for her mother echoing across the Virginia countryside. That night, Eleanor had knelt in her private chapel and made a vow that would transform her from a passive observer of human suffering into an active agent of liberation. She would use every resource at her disposal, her wealth, her social position, her extensive property holdings, to strike back at the system that had made Maria's anguish not only possible but legally protected. The practical challenges of operating an underground railroad station in the heart of Virginia had required Eleanor to develop skills that no finishing school had ever taught. She had learned to forge travel documents that would allow enslaved people to move through Confederate territory disguised as free blacks traveling on legitimate business. She had mastered the art of creating hiding places that could conceal human beings from the most thorough searches. Most importantly, she had built a network of allies among both the enslaved and free populations who could provide intelligence, transportation, and safe houses along the route to freedom. The tunnel that Eleanor was now excavating represented the culmination of 18 months of careful planning and preparation. The passage would run from the basement of Whitmore Manor to a hidden exit near the banks of the Rappahannock River, a distance of nearly 200 yards through soil that varied from rich loam to clay so hard it required pickaxes to penetrate. The tunnel would be large enough for adults to crawl through in single file, with wooden supports to prevent collapse and ventilation shafts disguised as drainage systems to ensure that occupants wouldn't suffocate during extended hiding periods. The engineering challenges alone would have daunted most professional contractors, but Eleanor had been forced to design and excavate the tunnel entirely by herself to maintain absolute secrecy. She had studied architectural texts in her late husband's library, learning about soil composition, structural support, and drainage systems with the intensity of a woman whose mistakes would cost human lives. Every night for the past 6 months, she had descended into the partially completed tunnel to continue the back-breaking work of moving tons of earth one shovelful at a time. The physical toll of this secret construction project was evident in Eleanor's appearance, though she had become expert at concealing the evidence of her nocturnal labors behind the facade of fashionable morning dress and carefully applied cosmetics. Her hands, once soft and unmarked by manual labor, were now permanently stained with dirt and calloused from gripping shovel handles and pickaxe heads. Her back ached constantly, from hours spent bent over in the confined space of the tunnel, while her shoulders had developed a strength that would have shocked the society ladies who knew her only as a delicate widow devoted to charitable works. The immediate crisis that had driven Eleanor to work through this particular night involved a group of 7 runaway slaves who had arrived at Whitmore Manor just after midnight. Guided by conductors who were part of the broader Underground Railroad network that stretched from the Deep South to Canada. The group included 2 families with young children whose presence made conventional hiding places inadequate and whose vulnerability made the need for secure concealment absolutely critical. The leader of the group was Samuel Freeman, a man in his 30s whose intelligence and natural authority marked him as the kind of enslaved person that white society found most threatening. Samuel had been planning this escape for over 2 years, carefully gathering information about routes, safe houses, and the methods used by slave catchers to recapture their prey. His wife Rebecca and their 2 young children represented both his greatest motivation for seeking freedom and his greatest vulnerability, as family groups were easier to track and faced even more severe punishments if recaptured. The other family consisted of Thomas and Sarah Williams, with their teenage daughter Mary, who had fled a plantation in North Carolina after learning that Mary was to be sold to a brothel in New Orleans. The girl's extraordinary beauty had made her valuable in ways that her parents understood would destroy her soul, even if it preserved her life, leading them to risk everything on a desperate gamble for freedom that would either save their daughter or result in all their deaths. The seventh member of the group was an elderly man named Josiah, whose advanced age made him a liability during the dangerous journey north, but whose knowledge of medicinal plants and spiritual traditions made him invaluable to the other escapees. Josiah carried with him a collection of herbs and roots that could treat injuries, prevent infections, and provide the kind of healing that might mean the difference between life and death during the weeks of travel that lay ahead. Eleanor's first sight of these 7 souls huddled in her kitchen had reinforced every moral conviction that had driven her to begin this dangerous work. The adults' faces showed the complex mixture of hope and terror that marked people who had gambled everything on the possibility of freedom, while the children's wide eyes reflected an innocence that slavery sought to destroy before it could fully develop. In that moment, Eleanor had understood that her tunnel represented more than just an engineering project. It was a pathway between the world of bondage and the realm of human dignity. The immediate challenge was keeping the group hidden, while Eleanor completed the tunnel's connection to the river exit point. Professional slave catchers were known to be operating throughout Richmond County, using bloodhounds and systematic search methods that made conventional hiding places increasingly dangerous. The partially completed tunnel offered the best hope of concealment, but only if Eleanor could finish the excavation before daylight brought renewed searches by bounty hunters who had been tracking the group since North Carolina. As Eleanor worked with desperate intensity in the pre-dawn darkness, she could hear the muffled voices of the people whose lives depended on her success. Samuel was organizing the group's limited supplies, while Rebecca tended to the children with the kind of fierce maternal protection that slavery had been unable to break. Thomas and Sarah whispered prayers in languages that combined African traditions with Christian hope, while Mary clung to her mother with the desperation of a young woman who understood exactly what fate awaited her if they were recaptured. The tunnel itself had become a symbol of everything that Eleanor believed about human dignity and the moral obligations that wealth and privilege imposed upon those fortunate enough to possess them. Every shovelful of earth she moved represented a rejection of the society that had raised her. Every wooden support beam she installed was a vote against the system that had made her family's prosperity possible. The physical act of creating this passage to freedom had become her own form of prayer, a meditation on justice that required no words but demanded everything she had to give. Above ground, Whitmore Manor maintained the elegant facade that Virginia society expected, with enslaved house servants going about their daily routines under the supervision of Eleanor's trusted housekeeper, Martha Washington, a free black woman whose own family had escaped slavery through Underground Railroad networks and who now served as Eleanor's primary ally in her resistance activities. Martha's presence in the household provided crucial credibility, as visiting neighbors and potential informants saw exactly what they expected to see: a proper Virginia widow maintaining her deceased husband's property with the help of appropriately subservient domestic staff. The broader context of Eleanor's activities was shaped by the increasingly desperate situation facing enslaved people throughout the South in the aftermath of the Fugitive Slave Act. What had once been a relatively manageable risk for those seeking freedom had become a death sentence carried out by federal law, as professional slave catchers could now operate with government sanction in every state of the Union. The Underground Railroad had been forced to extend its routes all the way to Canada, turning what had been journeys of hundreds of miles into odysseys of thousands of miles through territories where a captured runaway slave might be the most valuable commodity in the local economy. Eleanor's tunnel represented just one link in this extended chain of resistance, but its location in the heart of Virginia made it particularly crucial to the success of escape attempts originating throughout the Upper South. The passage she was creating would allow runaway slaves to bypass the most dangerous overland routes through Confederate territory, using the Rappahannock River system to reach Chesapeake Bay and eventually connect with maritime networks that could transport them to northern cities or directly to Canada. As dawn approached and Eleanor put the finishing touches on another section of the tunnel, she could hear the stirring of her household above, the familiar sounds of another day beginning at Whitmore Manor, masking the most important work of her life. Soon she would need to return to her role as a proper Virginia widow, attending to correspondence and social obligations, while the 7 people hidden beneath her home waited for darkness to continue their journey toward freedom. The secret passage that Eleanor Whitmore was creating would become legendary in Underground Railroad history, a testament to what one person could accomplish when moral conviction combined with practical resources and absolute determination. But tonight it was simply a hole in the ground that represented hope for 7 human beings whose only crime had been their desire to own themselves rather than be owned by others. The transformation of Eleanor Whitmore from a compliant society wife into the most audacious Underground Railroad conductor in Virginia had begun not with a single moment of moral awakening, but through a gradual accumulation of witnessed horrors that had slowly eroded the foundation of beliefs upon which her privileged existence had been built. As she continued her nocturnal excavation of the tunnel that would save countless lives, her mind drifted back to the series of events that had stripped away her illusions about the genteel civilization that had raised her, revealing the systematic brutality that lurked beneath Virginia's veneer of aristocratic refinement. Eleanor's childhood at Whitmore Manor had been carefully insulated from the harsh realities that made her family's luxury possible, but even the most elaborate deceptions couldn't completely hide the sounds that drifted across the Virginia countryside on summer nights. The crack of overseers' whips, the wailing of mothers whose children had been sold away, the desperate prayers of human beings whose suffering was considered essential to maintaining the economic system that supported plantation society. These sounds had haunted Eleanor's dreams throughout her youth, creating a subconscious awareness of moral contradictions that her conscious mind had been trained to ignore. The first crack in her carefully constructed worldview had appeared when she was 15 years old, during a garden party at a neighboring plantation where she had witnessed the casual brutality with which wealthy white women treated their personal servants. Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, one of Richmond County's most prominent society matrons, had ordered her enslaved maid beaten with a riding crop for the offense of accidentally breaking a teacup while serving refreshments to guests. The beating had taken place in full view of the assembled ladies, who had continued their conversation about charitable works and Christian duty, while a human being was systematically tortured for a minor accident. What had disturbed Eleanor most profoundly was not just the violence itself, but the complete indifference with which it was received by women who prided themselves on their moral sensitivity and religious devotion. These were the same ladies who wept over sentimental novels and contributed generously to missions for converting foreign heathens, yet they could watch a fellow human being suffer physical agony without experiencing the slightest discomfort or moral qualm. The education that had prepared Eleanor for her role as a plantation mistress had included detailed instruction in the management of enslaved people, lessons that revealed the systematic psychology behind maintaining human bondage. She had been taught to view enslaved people as perpetual children who required constant supervision and firm discipline, beings whose innate inferiority made slavery not just economically necessary, but morally beneficial to both races. The curriculum had included studies of pseudoscientific theories about racial hierarchy, biblical interpretations that justified human bondage as divinely ordained, and practical techniques for maximizing labor extraction while minimizing the costs of maintaining human property. But Eleanor's naturally analytical mind had begun to notice inconsistencies in these teachings that her instructors either couldn't or wouldn't address. If enslaved people were naturally inferior and benefited from white guidance, why did the system require such elaborate mechanisms of control and punishment? If slavery was truly a benevolent institution, why did it produce such obvious suffering among those it was supposed to help? If black people were inherently suited for bondage, why did so many risk their lives to escape a condition that was allegedly designed for their benefit? The marriage that had temporarily silenced these questions had been arranged between the Whitmore and Ashford families as a consolidation of land holdings and social position, uniting two of Richmond County's most prominent planter dynasties. Colonel James Whitmore had been 20 years older than Eleanor, a career military officer whose service in various Indian wars had given him a reputation for decisive action and unwavering devotion to Southern values. The match had been considered ideal by both families, combining Eleanor's beauty and refinement with James's military prestige and business acumen. During the early years of her marriage, Eleanor had attempted to fulfill the role of plantation mistress with the same dedication she had brought to her other accomplishments. She had supervised the household servants with what she believed was appropriate firmness tempered by Christian kindness, had managed the complex social obligations that came with her position, and had supported her husband's business ventures with the kind of intelligent assistance that planters expected from their wives. But the intimate exposure to plantation operations that came with her new responsibilities had gradually revealed aspects of slavery that her sheltered upbringing had kept hidden. She had been required to witness punishments, approve the sale of enslaved people, and make decisions about family separations that were presented as routine business matters, but which she could see caused devastating psychological trauma to the people involved. The turning point had come during the 3rd year of her marriage, when she had been present during the birth of a child to one of the plantation's enslaved women. The mother, a girl named Patience, who couldn't have been more than 16 years old, had endured a difficult labor that lasted nearly 2 days while Eleanor sat with her, providing what comfort she could. When the baby was finally born, a healthy boy with light skin that clearly indicated white paternity, Eleanor had felt a surge of maternal joy that was immediately crushed by the understanding that this child would grow up in the same bondage as his mother. The baby's father, Eleanor had realized with growing horror, was almost certainly her own husband, whose nighttime visits to the slave quarters were an open secret that plantation wives were expected to ignore as long as they were conducted discreetly. The child she had helped bring into the world was her husband's son, her own stepchild, yet he would be raised as property rather than family, destined for a life of unpaid labor and systematic degradation. That night, Eleanor had confronted James about his relationship with Patience, hoping that he might acknowledge the child and perhaps provide some measure of protection or special treatment. His response had shattered whatever illusions she still maintained about the moral foundations of their society. James had been genuinely puzzled by her distress, explaining with matter-of-fact calmness that sexual access to enslaved women was one of the traditional privileges of plantation ownership, no more morally significant than using any other form of property for his personal benefit. "You're thinking like a woman instead of like a planter's wife," James had told her with the patronizing tone he used when he believed she was being overly emotional. "These people aren't the same as us, Eleanor. They don't form the same attachments or experience the same feelings. It's actually a kindness to breed them with white stock. It improves their intelligence and makes them more valuable." The casual dehumanization in her husband's words had revealed the intellectual and moral bankruptcy that lay at the heart of plantation society's justifications for slavery. These people who prided themselves on their Christian faith and civilized behavior had constructed an elaborate mythology that allowed them to treat human beings as livestock while maintaining their self-image as moral and refined individuals. Following this revelation, Eleanor had begun to pay closer attention to the daily operations of the plantation, observing details that she had previously been trained to overlook. She had noticed the way enslaved mothers held their children with desperate intensity, understanding that any moment might bring forced separation. She had seen the careful masks that enslaved people wore around white authority, recognizing the intelligence and dignity that they were required to conceal in order to survive. Most importantly, she had begun to understand that the apparent contentment that planters attributed to their enslaved people was actually a performance designed to avoid punishment rather than evidence of genuine satisfaction with their condition. The network of resistance that Eleanor discovered operating beneath the surface of plantation life had been a revelation that challenged every assumption she had been raised to accept. Enslaved people maintained their own communication systems, their own forms of mutual aid, and their own methods of protecting each other from the worst excesses of white brutality. They preserved African cultural traditions, maintained family connections across plantation boundaries, and supported each other's efforts to learn skills that might eventually lead to freedom. Eleanor's gradual integration into this hidden world had begun with small acts of assistance, providing extra food to families with sick children, allowing enslaved people to visit relatives on other plantations, and turning a blind eye to activities that violated plantation rules but caused no actual harm. These minor rebellions had eventually led to more significant forms of cooperation, as enslaved people began to trust her with information about escape attempts and requests for active assistance. The death of her husband in Mexico had provided Eleanor with both the freedom and the resources to transform minor acts of kindness into systematic resistance to the institution of slavery. For the first time in her adult life, she had possessed the legal authority to make decisions about the treatment of the enslaved people under her control, along with access to the financial resources that could make a meaningful difference in their lives. Her first major underground railroad operation had involved helping a young couple escape to Philadelphia, using her social connections to arrange transportation and her financial resources to provide the forged documents and travel expenses necessary for the journey. The success of this initial effort had led to requests for assistance from conductors throughout the Underground Railroad network who recognized that a wealthy white woman in the heart of Virginia could provide forms of help that were unavailable through other channels. The construction of the tunnel had been inspired by the increasing dangers that runaway slaves faced in the aftermath of the Fugitive Slave Act. Professional slave catchers had begun operating throughout Virginia with federal support, using bloodhounds and systematic search techniques that made traditional hiding places increasingly ineffective. Eleanor had realized that her Underground Railroad activities would need to become more sophisticated if they were to continue saving lives without resulting in the capture and punishment of the people she was trying to help. The engineering challenges involved in excavating a 200-yard tunnel through Virginia soil had required Eleanor to develop skills that no finishing school had ever contemplated teaching to young ladies of her social class. She had studied geology texts to understand soil composition and drainage patterns, had learned carpentry techniques needed to construct wooden supports, and had mastered the complex logistics of removing tons of earth without attracting attention from neighbors or household staff. The physical demands of the construction work had transformed Eleanor's body in ways that would have shocked anyone who had known her only as a delicate society woman. Her hands, once soft and carefully maintained, were now permanently calloused and scarred from wielding pickaxes and shovels. Her back and shoulders had developed the kind of muscular strength that came from moving heavy loads of earth and timber through confined spaces. Most significantly, she had developed the mental toughness and problem-solving abilities that came from taking personal responsibility for work that could mean the difference between life and death for the people depending on her. The network of allies that had made Eleanor's Underground Railroad activities possible extended throughout Richmond County and beyond, including both enslaved and free black people who risked their lives to provide intelligence, transportation, and safe houses along the route to freedom. Martha Washington, Eleanor's housekeeper, served as the coordinator for much of this network, using her connections within the black community to identify trustworthy allies and gather information about the movements of slave catchers and federal marshals. Among the enslaved people on Eleanor's own plantations, a core group of trusted individuals had become essential to her operations, providing everything from skilled labor for tunnel construction to intelligence about suspicious activities in the surrounding area. These allies understood that discovery would mean their deaths, but they also understood that Eleanor's work represented their best hope for eventually achieving freedom for themselves and their families. The broader Underground Railroad network that Eleanor had joined stretched from the Deep South to Canada, involving thousands of people who risked everything to help enslaved people escape bondage. Conductors like Harriet Tubman had become legendary figures whose exploits inspired other abolitionists, but the network also depended on countless lesser-known individuals who provided safe houses, financial support, and the kinds of practical assistance that made escape attempts possible. Eleanor's unique position as a wealthy white woman in the heart of Virginia had made her contributions to this network particularly valuable, as she could provide forms of assistance that were simply unavailable through other channels. Her social connections allowed her to gather intelligence about law enforcement activities. Her financial resources enabled her to purchase supplies and transportation, and her legal status as a property owner provided cover for activities that would have immediately aroused suspicion if conducted by black people. The 7 runaway slaves currently hidden in Eleanor's basement represented just the latest in a series of groups that had passed through her Underground Railroad station over the past 18 months. Each successful escape had strengthened her commitment to the cause, while also increasing the risks involved, as slave catchers began to suspect that someone in Richmond County was providing systematic assistance to runaway slaves. The immediate challenge facing Eleanor and her allies was completing the tunnel connection to the river exit point before daylight brought renewed searches by bounty hunters who had been tracking the current group since North Carolina. Every hour of delay increased the risk of discovery, while the presence of young children in the group made conventional hiding places inadequate for extended periods. As Eleanor worked through the night, Moving tons of Virginia earth one shovelful at a time, she understood that she was not just excavating a passage beneath her home, she was digging a pathway between two different worlds, one defined by human bondage and the other by the possibility of human dignity. The tunnel represented everything she had come to believe about moral responsibility and the obligations that privilege imposed upon those fortunate enough to possess it. The physical act of creating this passage to freedom had become Eleanor's own form of prayer, a meditation on justice that required no words but demanded everything she had to give. With each shovelful of earth she moved, she was rejecting the society that had raised her and investing in a future where human beings would be valued for their inherent dignity rather than their economic utility. Above ground, the first stirrings of dawn were beginning to lighten the Virginia sky, bringing with them the urgent need to complete the tunnel's connection to freedom before the day brought new dangers for the 7 souls whose lives depended on Eleanor's success. The sound of bloodhounds baying in the distance cut through the Virginia dawn like knives through Eleanor's heart, their mournful howls announcing that professional slave catchers had picked up the trail of the 7 people hidden beneath her home. Eleanor's mud-caked hands gripped the shovel handle with desperate intensity as she realized that her tunnel excavation had become a literal race between freedom and death. Every minute of delay brought the hunters closer to their prey, while every shovelful of earth moved her refugees one step closer to the river that represented their only hope of escape. The hunting party that had been tracking the runaways since North Carolina consisted of 3 of the most feared slave catchers in the South, led by Josiah Blackwood, a man whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his success rate in recapturing human property. Blackwood operated with the full authority of federal law behind him, carrying documents that allowed him to search any property, question any person, and seize any suspected runaway slave without regard for local jurisdictions or property rights. "They're close now," Martha Washington whispered, as she descended into the tunnel carrying another load of wooden support beams. "Blackwood's been asking questions at the Ashford place, showing papers that say he's got government authority to search wherever he pleases." Mrs. Ashford told him he was welcome to look anywhere on her property, but she mentioned seeing strangers on our road 2 nights past. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she understood the implications of Martha's report. The Ashford plantation bordered Whitmore Manor to the north, and Cordelia Ashford's casual mention of suspicious activity would certainly prompt Blackwood to expand his search to include Eleanor's property. The slave catcher's federal documents would override any objections she might raise, and a thorough search of the main house would inevitably lead to the discovery of the partially hidden entrance to the tunnel system. The 7 refugees huddled in the basement above Eleanor's head represented a cross-section of the human suffering that slavery inflicted upon families throughout the South. Samuel Freeman had been a skilled blacksmith whose intelligence and leadership abilities had marked him as dangerous in the eyes of his owner, leading to increasingly harsh treatment designed to break his spirit before he could inspire other enslaved people to resistance. His wife Rebecca had been forced to serve as a wet nurse for her master's children, while her own babies were weaned early and given minimal care, a common practice that allowed enslaved women's bodies to be exploited for the benefit of white families while their own children suffered malnutrition and neglect. Their 2 children, 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Sarah, had already experienced trauma that would have broken most adults, watching their parents endure systematic humiliation and violence while understanding that their own futures held nothing but a lifetime of unpaid labor and degradation. The family's decision to risk everything on an escape attempt had been prompted by their master's announcement that young Thomas would be sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where the mortality rate among enslaved children was so high that it amounted to a death sentence. The second family, Thomas and Sarah Williams, with their teenage daughter Mary, represented another common tragedy of the slavery system, parents forced to watch helplessly as their child faced sexual exploitation that the law not only permitted but protected. Mary's extraordinary beauty had attracted the attention of slave traders who specialized in supplying young women to brothels in New Orleans, where enslaved girls were trained from childhood to serve the sexual appetites of white men who viewed them as objects existing solely for their pleasure. The Williams family's escape had been triggered by the arrival of Alphonse Thibodeau, a New Orleans brothel owner who had offered their master $3,000 for exclusive rights to Mary's sexual services. The transaction had been presented as a business deal no different from the sale of livestock, with detailed negotiations about the girl's physical attributes and potential earning capacity in the commercial sex trade. The seventh member of the group, elderly Josiah, carried within his weathered frame the accumulated knowledge of African spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and adapted to American conditions. His presence in the escape party served multiple purposes. His knowledge of medicinal plants could mean the difference between life and death during the dangerous journey ahead, while his spiritual authority provided the kind of moral leadership that helped maintain group cohesion under extreme stress. As Eleanor worked with increasingly desperate intensity to complete the tunnel's connection to the river exit point, she could hear the muffled voices of the people whose lives depended on her success. Samuel was organizing the group's limited supplies while trying to maintain morale among companions who understood that capture would mean death or worse. Rebecca was tending to the children with the fierce maternal protection that slavery had been unable to destroy, while Mary clung to her parents with the desperation of a young woman who knew exactly what fate awaited her if the slave catchers succeeded in their hunt. The engineering challenges that Eleanor faced in completing the tunnel had become exponentially more complex as she approached the exit point near the riverbank. The soil composition changed dramatically as she neared the water table, shifting from the relatively stable clay that had characterized most of the excavation to a mixture of sand and gravel that required different support techniques to prevent collapse. The final 50 feet of tunnel would need to be reinforced with additional wooden beams, while maintaining the precise angle needed to ensure that the exit remained hidden beneath the riverbank's overhang. The sound of approaching horses announced that Blackwood's hunting party had reached the main road that led to Whitmore Manor, their arrival preceded by the increasingly frantic baying of bloodhounds that had detected scents leading directly toward Eleanor's property. Through the ventilation shaft that connected the tunnel to the surface, Eleanor could hear the distinctive sound of men dismounting and organizing their search equipment, the jingle of chains that would be used to restrain captured runaways, the click of weapons being checked and loaded, and the harsh voices of professional manhunters discussing their strategy for systematic investigation of the plantation grounds. "Mrs. Whitmore!" The voice that echoed across the plantation's front lawn belonged to Josiah Blackwood himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout the Underground Railroad network. "We need to have a word with you about some property that's gone missing from down Carolina Way." Eleanor's hands shook as she realized that the moment she had been preparing for throughout 18 months of Underground Railroad activities had finally arrived. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed in, everything she had risked would be tested in the next few hours as she faced the most dangerous slave catcher in the South, while 7 human beings depended on her ability to maintain the deception that had kept her activities secret. The plan that Eleanor and Martha had developed for this exact scenario required split-second timing and absolute commitment from everyone involved. Martha would go to the front door and engage Blackwood in conversation, explaining that Mrs. Whitmore was indisposed due to her recent illness, but would be available to speak with him shortly. This would provide Eleanor with precious minutes to complete the tunnel connection and get the refugees started on their underground journey to the river exit point. Meanwhile, Eleanor would need to clean herself up enough to pass casual inspection, hiding the evidence of her nocturnal excavation work while maintaining the facade of a delicate widow who spent her time engaged in appropriate feminine pursuits. The success of this deception would depend on Blackwood's assumptions about what a lady of Eleanor's social standing was capable of accomplishing, assumptions that had consistently worked in her favor throughout her Underground Railroad career. The final phase of tunnel construction required Eleanor to work with an intensity that pushed her physical capabilities beyond anything she had previously experienced. The wooden support beams had to be positioned with perfect precision to prevent collapse, while the angle of the final descent had to be calculated exactly to ensure that the exit would remain concealed beneath the riverbank's natural overhang. Every motion had to be efficient and purposeful, as wasted effort could mean the difference between freedom and capture for the 7 people waiting above. As Eleanor drove herself toward completion of the tunnel, she could hear Martha's voice engaging Blackwood in the kind of elaborately polite Southern conversation that was designed to convey respect for his authority while subtly delaying his access to the main house. Martha was reporting that Mrs. Whitmore had been suffering from a recurring fever that had kept her confined to her chambers, but that she would certainly be happy to assist Mr. Blackwood with his official duties as soon as she was able to receive visitors properly. "That's mighty considerate of the lady." Blackwood's voice carried the kind of false courtesy that poorly concealed impatience and suspicion. "But I'm afraid this is official federal business that can't wait for social niceties. These runaways I'm tracking are dangerous criminals who pose a threat to public safety, and I've got authority to search any property where they might be hiding." The legal implications of Blackwood's words were clear. The Fugitive Slave Act gave him powers that superseded local property rights and social conventions, allowing him to conduct searches that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Eleanor's status as a wealthy white woman provided some protection, but not enough to prevent a determined slave catcher from investigating suspicious circumstances on her property. The breakthrough that Eleanor had been working toward for 6 months came at the moment when Blackwood's patience finally ran out, and he began moving toward the main house, despite Martha's efforts to delay him. The final shovelful of earth that separated the tunnel from the riverbank gave way with a satisfying thud, revealing an opening that would allow the refugees to crawl directly into the dense brush that concealed the Rappahannock's shoreline. "It's done," Eleanor whispered urgently into the ventilation shaft that connected her to the basement where the 7 runaways waited. "The passage is open. Samuel, get your people moving now." The evacuation of 7 human beings through a tunnel, barely large enough for one person at a time, became an exercise in controlled panic that tested everyone's courage and determination. Samuel went first, carrying the group's few precious possessions, while testing the structural integrity of Eleanor's construction work. Rebecca followed with baby Sarah in her arms, crawling through darkness toward a freedom she had never dared to imagine possible. The children moved next, their small bodies allowing them to navigate the confined space more easily than the adults, but their fear making every foot of progress a triumph of will over terror. Thomas Williams and his wife Sarah crawled after their daughter Mary, their hands touching the soil that Eleanor had moved grain by grain to create this pathway between bondage and dignity. Old Josiah brought up the rear, his aged frame making the journey more difficult, but his spiritual presence providing the kind of moral support that transformed a desperate escape into an act of collective courage. As he disappeared into the tunnel's depths, Eleanor could hear him humming spirituals that connected this moment to generations of resistance against oppression. Above ground, the sound of Blackwood's boots on the front porch announced that Eleanor's time for preparation had run out. She scrambled up from the basement, her heart pounding as she realized that the next few minutes would determine whether her 18 months of underground railroad work would end in triumph or catastrophe. The confrontation that would decide the fate of 7 human beings was about to begin, as Eleanor Whitmore prepared to face the most dangerous slave catcher in the South, while freedom seekers crawled through the tunnel she had carved beneath Virginia soil with her own bleeding hands. The confrontation between Eleanor Whitmore and Josiah Blackwood unfolded in the elegant parlor of Whitmore Manor with the deadly precision of a chess match where human lives hung in the balance with every move. Eleanor descended the main staircase with the practiced grace that 20 years of Virginia society had taught her, her morning dress impeccably arranged and her face displaying just the right combination of delicate femininity and aristocratic authority. Beneath this carefully crafted exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated the minutes it would take for 7 people to crawl 200 yards through the tunnel she had carved with her own bleeding hands. Blackwood stood in her parlor like a predator, surveying territory he intended to claim, his pale eyes cataloguing every detail of the room's elegant furnishings, while his trained senses searched for any sign of the human quarry he had been tracking across 3 states. At 45, he possessed the lean, dangerous look of a man who had spent 2 decades hunting other human beings for profit, his success measured in the screams of recaptured runaways and the gold coins that plantation owners paid for the return of their escaped property. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood's voice carried the false courtesy that barely concealed a predator's hunger. "I appreciate you taking time from your recovery to speak with me. I'm sure Martha explained that I'm here on federal business, tracking dangerous fugitives who pose a threat to public safety throughout this region." Eleanor settled into her chair with the deliberate movements of a woman whose physical frailty required careful management, a performance designed to reinforce Blackwood's assumptions about what a lady of her station could possibly accomplish. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, I'm always happy to assist the proper authorities, though I'm afraid my recent illness has left me rather confined to the house. I know very little about activities beyond my immediate grounds." The slave catcher's eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor's face, searching for the telltale signs of deception that his experience had taught him to recognize. But Eleanor's expression reflected only the appropriate concern of a law-abiding citizen confronted with reports of dangerous criminals in her vicinity, her features arranged in the mask of feminine helplessness that had protected countless Southern women from suspicions about their true capabilities. "These fugitives I'm tracking are particularly dangerous," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man who enjoyed describing the suffering he inflicted upon others. 7 of them traveling together, 2 families with children and an old man who's probably their conjure doctor. They've been moving through underground railroad networks, using routes that require assistance from traitors who think they can undermine the lawful institution of slavery. As Blackwood spoke, Eleanor's mind tracked the progress of the very people he was describing, calculating their movement through the tunnel system she had designed with mathematical precision. Samuel would be emerging at the river exit point by now, checking to ensure that the coast was clear before signaling for the others to follow. Rebecca and the children would be halfway through the passage, crawling through darkness toward a freedom that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The interrogation that followed tested every skill that Eleanor had developed during 18 months of underground railroad activities, as Blackwood employed techniques designed to trap her in contradictions or force her to reveal knowledge that would betray her involvement in the escape network. He described the runaways in detailed terms that would have been familiar to anyone who had recently encountered them, watching Eleanor's face for any flicker of recognition that might confirm his suspicions about her property serving as a way station. "The leader's a big buck named Samuel Freeman," Blackwood said, his language deliberately chosen to reinforce the dehumanization that made slave-catching psychologically possible. "Smart one, too smart for his own good, the kind that gives other slaves ideas about running. Been planning this escape for years, according to his former owner. Probably had help from white folks who don't understand the danger they're courting." Eleanor's response revealed nothing beyond appropriate shock at the suggestion that civilized white people might involve themselves in such dangerous activities. "How terrible that such criminals are operating in our area. I do hope you'll be able to capture them quickly, before they can harm any innocent families." But Blackwood's suspicions were based on more than intuition. His investigation had uncovered evidence that someone in Richmond County was providing systematic assistance to runaway slaves, and Eleanor's property occupied a strategic position that would make it ideal for underground railroad activities. The slave catcher had spent the previous day interviewing neighbors and servants, gathering fragments of information that painted a picture of unusual activities at Whitmore Manor. "Funny thing about your place, Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood said with the casual tone of a man laying a carefully prepared trap. "Several folks mentioned seeing strangers on your road at odd hours. Lights in windows that should have been dark. Sounds that didn't quite make sense for a widow lady living quiet like you claim to be doing." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, requiring Eleanor to navigate between outright denial and explanations that might satisfy Blackwood's suspicions without admitting to activities that would result in her arrest and the death of everyone who had helped her. Her response drew upon the elaborate mythology that Southern society had constructed around feminine weakness and the natural limitations of genteel women. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed about my capabilities, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said with the gentle firmness of a woman correcting misconceptions about her character. "My recent illness has left me quite weak, and I rarely leave my chambers after dark. As for lights and sounds, I'm sure Martha can explain the medical requirements that have disrupted our normal household routines." Martha's supporting testimony provided crucial corroboration for Eleanor's story, describing the widow's prolonged recovery from a fever that had required constant nursing care and irregular schedules for medication and treatment. The housekeeper's status as a free black woman gave her testimony additional credibility, as Blackwood understood that free blacks typically avoided any involvement in underground railroad activities that might jeopardize their own precarious legal status. But the slave catcher's investigation had uncovered one piece of evidence that threatened to destroy Eleanor's carefully constructed deception. During his search of the plantation's outbuildings, Blackwood had discovered fresh soil that appeared to have been recently excavated and then redistributed around the property. The quantity of earth involved suggested construction work far more extensive than normal garden maintenance or routine repairs. "Here's what puzzles me most, Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood said, as he produced a handful of soil from his coat pocket. "Found this dirt scattered around your property in places where it doesn't naturally belong. Clay soil mixed with river sand. Like someone's been digging near the water and then spreading the earth around to hide what they've been doing." Eleanor's heart stopped as she recognized soil from the tunnel excavation, evidence that could destroy her if Blackwood possessed the persistence to follow the trail back to its source. The slave catcher's trained eye had detected signs that would have been invisible to casual observers, proof that his reputation for thorough investigation was well-deserved. The explanation that Eleanor provided for the suspicious soil drew upon her late husband's military background and her own supposed interests in commemorative gardening projects. She described plans to create a memorial garden honoring Colonel Whitmore's service in the Mexican War, work that had required moving substantial quantities of earth to create the proper topographical features for the planned monument. "James always loved the view of the river from our grounds," Eleanor said with the wistful tone of a grieving widow. "I thought a memorial garden near the water would be a fitting tribute to his memory. The work has been quite challenging for someone in my condition, which probably explains the irregular hours and unusual activities that your informants reported." Blackwood's response revealed that he wasn't entirely convinced by Eleanor's explanations, but that he lacked sufficient evidence to justify the kind of thorough search that would uncover the tunnel entrance in the basement. The slave catcher's federal authority was broad, but not unlimited, and antagonizing wealthy white citizens without clear justification could create political problems that might interfere with his profitable hunting activities. The moment when Blackwood finally decided to terminate his investigation came as Eleanor calculated that the last of her refugees should be emerging from the tunnel exit point and disappearing into the dense vegetation along the riverbank. The slave catcher's frustration was evident in his increasingly aggressive questioning, but Eleanor's performance as a delicate widow lady had successfully reinforced his assumptions about what someone of her gender and social status could possibly accomplish. "I'll be moving my search downstream along the river," Blackwood announced as he prepared to leave Whitmore Manor. "These runaways have got to cross water somewhere, and I've got men positioned at all the main ford points. If they're still in this area, we'll have them before nightfall." Eleanor's relief at Blackwood's departure was tempered by understanding that the 7 people she had helped escape were still in mortal danger, facing a journey of hundreds of miles through territory where their recapture would mean death or worse. The tunnel she had excavated represented only the first stage of their quest for freedom, providing them with a head start that might make the difference between success and failure in their desperate gamble for human dignity. The broader impact of Eleanor's Underground Railroad activities extended far beyond the individual lives she had saved, as word of her tunnel system spread through the network of conductors and safe house operators who comprised the secret war against slavery. Her innovation had inspired similar construction projects in other strategic locations, while her success in maintaining her cover as a conventional Southern widow had demonstrated that effective resistance could be hidden beneath the most unlikely disguises. The intelligence network that Eleanor had developed during her 18 months of Underground Railroad work continued to operate long after Blackwood's departure, providing early warning of slave catcher activities while coordinating the movement of freedom seekers through increasingly sophisticated escape routes. Martha Washington's connections within Richmond County's Black community proved invaluable for gathering information and identifying trustworthy allies, while Eleanor's social position allowed her to gather intelligence from sources that were unavailable to other conductors. The 7 refugees who had crawled through Eleanor's tunnel to freedom represented a cross-section of the human suffering that slavery inflicted throughout the South, but their successful escape also demonstrated the power of coordinated resistance to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Samuel Freeman's intelligence and leadership abilities, which had marked him as dangerous to his former owner, became assets that helped guide the group through the treacherous journey to Canada and ultimate freedom. The Williams family's escape from the sexual exploitation that awaited their daughter Mary illustrated one of slavery's most horrific aspects, while also showing how parental love could motivate acts of extraordinary courage. Mary's successful journey to freedom would allow her to grow into womanhood with her dignity intact, free from the systematic sexual violence that destroyed so many enslaved women throughout the South. Old Josiah's survival of the dangerous journey north carried special significance for the Underground Railroad network, as his knowledge of African spiritual traditions and medicinal practices made him a valuable resource for other freedom seekers who would benefit from his wisdom and experience. His presence in Canada's growing community of formerly enslaved Americans helped preserve cultural traditions that slavery had tried to destroy. The tunnel system that Eleanor had constructed beneath Whitmore Manor continued to operate for 2 more years after the dramatic escape that had nearly exposed her activities to Josiah Blackwood. During this period, an estimated 63 additional people used the passage to begin their journeys toward freedom, making Eleanor's innovation one of the most successful underground railroad stations in Virginia. The end of Eleanor's active involvement in underground railroad work came not through discovery by slave catchers, but through the escalating tensions that preceded the Civil War. The Fugitive Slave Act's enforcement had become increasingly violent, while southern states began implementing security measures that made clandestine activities far more dangerous than they had been during the tunnel's early operations. Eleanor's decision to suspend her Underground Railroad activities was prompted by intelligence that federal authorities were planning systematic investigations of suspected safehouse operators throughout Virginia, using techniques that would make her continued operations impossible to conceal. Rather than risk the lives of her allies and the people she was trying to help, Eleanor chose to redirect her resistance efforts towards supporting the political and military forces that would eventually end slavery through conventional warfare. The Civil War's outbreak in 1861 transformed Eleanor from a secret conductor into an open supporter of Union forces, using her wealth and social connections to provide intelligence and supplies to Northern armies operating in Virginia. Her intimate knowledge of local geography and transportation networks, gained through years of Underground Railroad work, proved invaluable to military planners who needed detailed information about Confederate positions and movements. The liberation of Richmond County by Union forces in 1863 allowed Eleanor to finally reveal the full extent of her Underground Railroad activities, as the tunnel system beneath Whitmore Manor became a symbol of the resistance that had been operating throughout the South during slavery's final decades. Former refugees who had used Eleanor's passage returned to Virginia to thank the woman whose courage had made their freedom possible, while historians began documenting the extraordinary story of the Virginia widow who had built hope beneath her home. Eleanor Whitmore died in 1889, having lived long enough to see the complete abolition of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction efforts to build a more just society on the ruins of the plantation system. Her funeral was attended by dozens of formerly enslaved people whose freedom had been made possible by her tunnel, along with their children and grandchildren who represented the generations that would benefit from her courage. Eleanor Whitmore's story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most effective revolutionaries are those who work in secret, using the very privileges that an unjust system grants them to undermine its foundations. If this tale of courage, ingenuity, and moral conviction has inspired you, moved you, or made you think differently about what one person can accomplish when they commit everything to justice, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten tales of the heroes whose names deserve to be remembered.